Hi, I'm Jerry Sparks, President of AG Financial Insurance Solutions. And once again, we have Rich Hammer, renowned church law attorney for the General Counsel, and glad to have you here again.
Thanks, Jerry.
If anybody has any questions, they can email us the questions, and we'll try to answer them during this webinar. So I just wanted to remind you of that. We're going to talk about liability insurance today and limits of insurance, what kind of liability insurance, and the different kinds of liability insurance. And I figured we'd just start off with something easy like a slip and fall and how a slip and fall can affect a church. Can you tell us about a case that we had with slip and fall?
Yes, Jerry. You think of slips and falls as being just, minor, of no consequence to the church. These things are going to happen, and, we got insurance to cover it, so what's the big deal? And yet, here's an example of a slip and fall case that devastated a church. It was not a large church either, but they were having a potluck dinner in the church basement, and it had been rainy that day, and people were coming in with water-soaked coats and things, and there was a puddle of water on the linoleum floor in the church basement where this potluck dinner was being held. And an individual slipped on that puddle and broke his arm. And that arm break resulted in neurological damage, which prevented him, probably for life, from performing his vocation, which turned out to be a surgeon. And because of the loss of income, that claim ended up being for $17 million.
Wow.
For a slip and fall in a church basement. So what's the lesson here? That slips and falls can result in staggering amounts of liability. So I think the takeaway point is not to let surgeons attend potluck dinners.
Most of the time slip and falls will come under the medical payments, which is normally limited to a maximum of $5,000, where there is no actual liability on your case. But how many times do we see a slip and fall happen because somebody forgot to clean a sidewalk of ice?
Yes.
Or pick up a puddle of water, and then there becomes liability. Once there becomes liability, you bypass the medical payments and go right to your limit of liability. So how much general liability should a church carry?
Well, Jerry, I get asked this question all the time, and I think it really has to do with a couple of important factors. And number one is the nature of the activities that your church conducts. The more activities, especially off-site activities, especially activities involving minors, the greater the risk is and the greater the need for insurance. So, for example, if you have an active preschool program, children's ministries, youth ministries involving multiple activities and programs, minors are clearly associated with the greatest risk. And so you have to evaluate your activities. What are we doing? What kind of programs do we have, especially those that serve youth? There are other at-risk groups as well, but youth would be the top. So the more of these activities you have, the greater the need for insurance in greater amounts. And then secondly, I think most authorities say that your liability insurance should be pegged to your net assets. Your assets, your balance sheet asset, less liabilities. So that's something that you need to be protecting, and you might want to add to that.
No, actually, that's the two things that we actually look at is looking at how much does the church have to lose to begin with, and what they're worth. And there's different ways that they can set up their assets that they have. For instance, putting the church building, if they're doing a lot of outside activities, maybe setting up a separate limited liability company or a separate corporation for those activities to help protect the church. Setting up a minimum limit of liability, we try to make, we suggest to every church that they have a minimum liability of $1 million. Whether it's automobile liability or general liability, one of the things that we really stress, it's just too easy to have an accident, and in our courts are very litigious anymore as far as suing churches, that they would have $1 million limit of liability. Do you agree with that?
I've never had a rule of thumb like that. I'm not opposed to that. I suppose maybe in a smaller rural church, you could make an argument that that might be high. It might be in excess because of the very limited numbers of programs and activities they have, especially for minors. and because of the limited net asset value of a smaller church that may be just $100,000 or $200,000. So some would argue, I think, Jerry, that there may be exceptions to that rule, but here's the point I want to make. Risks don't differentiate in terms of the size of a church. And a sexual molestation claim involving a minor can happen just as well, just as easily in a rural church with 30 parishioners as it can in a mega church in a more urban area. And risks like that, like I say, don't differentiate. So I've seen many cases of child molestation where the claim occurred in a smaller church where some might have said, well, you'll need $100,000 of liability. That was not the case. So I wouldn't be opposed to that, but you're going to run into small church pastors that are going to say, why do we need $1 million? You need to be ready to make that case.
And one of the things that would come out with that, if I told you, if you were going to a court and I told you for $100 you could have bought $1 million worth of coverage versus that $300,000 liability, and you go to court and you've been sued, and they come back to the insurance agent and said, would you have bought this if the insurance agent would have sold this to you? And they would absolutely say yes. So that's one of the reasons why we strive to have everybody have that amount of coverage.
Can I add a point
Sure.
here, Jerry? We've talked about how much to have. Another important question we might hit right here at the top is, how should a church go about obtaining insurance? I get asked this question all the time. How do we obtain insurance? And I'd like to make a few comments in response to that I typically share, and then to have you weigh in on this as well. But I think it's important for churches when they're selecting liability insurance to have an insurance committee that the board appoints to evaluate insurance products and options. And if you can, have expertise on that committee. The problem I see in a number of churches is you have somebody, an insurance agent in the church, maybe on the board, maybe on the committee, that steers the decision to his or her company, which may not be in the best interest of the church. So you need to be careful about that. I do believe that churches are better served by using a dedicated church insurance company rather than an insurance company that sells to churches. There's a huge difference in terms of expertise in knowing how to respond to a church when a claim arises by dedicated church insurance companies that work in this environment. Let me also mention this. Do not make the decision entirely on the basis of price. Yes, you may be able to get a cheaper price from some unknown company than from a dedicated church insurance company, but that can be a foolish and unwise decision in many cases.
I agree with you 100%. I see companies that write insurance for churches, but the coverages may not be the same as they are with a church carrier. The limits may be the same, but the coverages aren't the same. So when they look at a typical person would look at a comparison and said, oh, all the limits look exactly the same, but the difference is actually in the coverages. So you have to be very, very careful with that.
In the coverages and in the value added
right.
Concept of the dedicated church insurance company typically is going to provide you with very good advice when a claim arises or before a claim arises with regard to risk management.
Yeah, and actually they'll probably help you with risk management from the get-go. So actually, hopefully you can prevent that claim. Mm-hmm. Let's just talk a little bit about sexual misconduct, because we got into that. And actually, with us insuring over 3,800 churches, a lot of times I see that the large churches actually, if they're named in a lawsuit for sexual misconduct, they actually get out of it because they've done the reference checks. Mm-hmm. They've done the background checks. With the smaller churches, when you have a church of 200, a lot of times they're sitting there going, this person has actually worked with minors forever and has attended our church forever, so we really don't need to do a background check. Mm-hmm. We don't need to do reference checks. Everybody knows him. He's worked with us forever and ever. That's where the claims actually end up occurring. That's where I see an issue. And you want to comment on that?
Well, that can also happen in large churches, Jerry. I think maybe less so now than in the past, but probably the third or fourth largest verdict ever rendered against a church in American history involved a church where the pastor hired a youth minister without any background checks because he'd worked with him in a prior church years ago. So what do we need to screen this guy for? I know this guy. And, well, that guy was hired, and he molested 17 adolescent boys in that church. A lawsuit was filed by one of those boys, and it resulted in a verdict of $7 million. Much of that was punitive damages. And then there were 13 other victims in the wings. So there was a horrendous case involving a church. It was a large church. And because the pastor thought he knew the youth pastor, we don't need to screen him. What does that show us? Ronald Reagan's theory of arms negotiating with the Soviets: trust but verify. And that's what that pastor failed to do.
Let's talk about one of the things that happens a lot of times with sexual misconduct coverage is that there is two different types of actual coverage. One is called claims made coverage, and one is called occurrence coverage. And do you have would you like to comment on that?
Well, why don't you explain both of those, and
okay.
We can take it from there.
An occurrence policy, as long as you stay on an occurrence policy forever and ever, no matter when the claims occur, that policy is going to cover it. With a claims made policy, it happens to go back to whenever that claim occurred. So if you have a claims made policy, one of the important things to do is once you have that claims made policy, you need to have a retroactive date back to the first day that you had a claims made policy. So for instance, when one of our large insureds had a retro date going back to 2003, our retro date still goes back to 2003 effective today. So if any claims get reported from 2003, 2004, 2005, because they don't always come right then and there, we have coverage going back to that date. But it is the current carrier that is going to pick up that coverage. One of the things that I see happen a lot of times is with a claims made policy is we'll write a new policy for you, and they don't change. They leave the retro date is the effective date this year. Well, you just lost 6 years worth of coverage in there. Now the price is a lot cheaper, but you just picked up a lot of liability that you didn't expect to. So you have to be very, very careful when it comes to claims made versus occurrence. One of the other things too is defense inside the limits or outside the limits. When you look at the amount of coverage you have, a big factor, because defense cost, as you know, can cost into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, is that inside your limit or outside your limit?
And many churches do have occurrence coverage for sexual misconduct. And so what that means is you've got to be able to find the insurance contract or policy for that period when this claim arose. So, for example, you get sued this week by a person that claims that she was molested by a church worker when she was 4 years old. She doesn't even know the person's name. By an unknown church worker. I've seen these cases. And in 1960, well, how in the world is that church going to launch a defense? That's one issue. But a second issue is, are they going to be able to have insurance coverage for that claim because of an insurance contract? And Jerry, this gets to the whole issue of record retention. How many churches keep those policies from 50 years ago?
Right.
Yeah, they just throw them out. But you're throwing out an invaluable piece of evidence to prove and substantiate that you had coverage for that year. The insurance companies aren't going to help you with that. There's no insurance commission somewhere that's going to say, yes, here was your insurance company. That is your responsibility. So when I describe records that should be kept permanently, one of those records is all your insurance policies, because of the fact that claims can come from decades in the past, and you've got to find the policy that was in effect at that time.
Yeah, we have actually had that happen where we've had lawsuits come in from 17 years, something that happened 17 years ago, and we actually had to go back to the policy 17 years ago. Who was writing our insurance coverage at that time, and can we prove it with a policy number and everything else? Because the insurance company, you're absolutely correct. We knew what insurance company it was, and they says, until you give us a policy number, we're not going to cover it.
That's it.
And so you have to be very careful, and retention is a good point to keep that general liability policy forever. Let's talk.
And Jerry, let me say this with regard to sexual misconduct. I think it's important to point out that many church insurance policies, general and liability policies, limit sexual misconduct coverage in terms of the dollar amount that's available, or they exclude it entirely. And even if they don't, there have been many cases, many lawsuits over this point of insurance coverage, because many times insurance companies will seek to deny any insurance coverage for a church when there's a claim of sexual abuse involving a pastor or volunteer youth worker. It can be with an adult victim, it can be with a child. But the fact is, every insurance policy has an exclusion. This is universal for intentional or criminal conduct. And the insurance claim is, hey, this was intentional conduct. This was criminal conduct. That's an exclusion under our policy. And you know what? That's true. But the church's argument in response is, well, we didn't engage in intentional or criminal conduct. We're not being sued for intentional conduct. We're being sued for negligence. Negligent selection. We were negligent in selecting this perpetrator, or we were negligent in retaining the perpetrator, or in supervising the perpetrator. So our liability is rooted in negligence. Look at the lawsuit. That's what it says. So, and I can tell you, the courts have not been consistent on this issue. Some have agreed with the church and said the insurance company needs to cover this claim and indemnify it. But some courts have reached the opposite conclusion.
Wow.
So it's very important for church leaders, for your insurance committee, when you're evaluating all these coverages and these potential insurance companies to do business with, find out, are you going to abandon us? One of the main reasons we get insurance is for these horrific child abuse claims. We do everything we can to protect children, to screen workers, but we're still vulnerable to these claims. And are you going to cover us, the church? You're insured. If we have a claim, are you going to say, that's intentional misconduct, so we're abandoning you? You better get that straight. And I'll tell you what, you better deal with a company that gives you the right answer to that question. No, we're not going to abandon you. We agree. You were not engaged in intentional or criminal misconduct. You are sued for negligence. We're covering you. And I'll tell you what, you better get that in writing. And that may be with the company that you pay a little bit more for the premium. Do you want to deal with one of these fly-by-night companies that offers you a cheaper rate, and come to find out, for this issue, among others, you don't have coverage because of their interpretation of the policy? So there again, you get back to the need for expertise on an insurance committee, evaluating your options every year. And this is one of the important issues that committee needs to address.
Let's change a little bit and go to counseling liability. I know that one of the major things that we've also seen is actually with pastoral counseling. And we had an actual case where the pastor's wife was counseling, and the person in counseling told this pastor's wife something, and because of that, they actually investigated this and actually had a person arrested because of something that was told in this counseling, and it was found out later to be untrue. And do our churches carrying counseling liability? A lot of times I see pastors saying, I don't have a need for pastoral counseling liability. And I say just the opposite. You're counseling all the time. If you tell if you're visiting with somebody, it may just be nonchalantly or whatever. You have a lot of people in the church that are doing counseling for the church, whether you realize it or not.
Yeah, and I would say this. When we talk about counseling liability, we're basically talking about malpractice. And when it comes to clergy, the courts are clear that a church or minister cannot be sued on the basis of malpractice because of the content of advice that they give. In the leading case, a suicidal young man was told by a church, if you commit suicide, he asked the question, if I commit suicide, will I go to heaven? And on this recording that was a key piece of evidence in that case, you could hear the instructor in the Sunday school class say, yes, suicide will not separate you from God's love or from heaven. It's God's way of telling a disobedient believer, it's time to come home. Well, this guy did commit suicide. And they sued the pastoral staff, some of the counselors, some of whom were pastors. And the bottom line was, a state Supreme Court ruled that the church and its pastors were what they called non-therapist counselors. They were not recognized as counselors by the state. They weren't, psychologists or licensed counselors. And because they were non-therapist counselors, it would violate the First Amendment guarantee of religious freedom to hold them liable for the content. Because what are you doing? You're holding liable scriptural-based counseling, which is what this church tried to exercise. And the court said, we're not going to go there. That violates the freedom of religion component of the First Amendment. But they said that only applies to non-therapist counselors who are clergy, not to lay counselors, and not to clergy counselors who engage in secular counseling modalities. So I think you're right, Jerry, that there are opportunities for litigation when it comes to counseling. An argument could be made. I've seen many of these cases. Okay, we agree, malpractice, clergy should not be liable on that basis for their spiritual counseling. But in many of these cases, the argument's made, well, the pastor wasn't engaging in spiritual or biblical counseling. He was engaged in secular counseling techniques, or the pastor was a licensed counselor with the state, in which case the First Amendment protections go way down and expose the pastor to liability. So there's a lot of issues here, and I think one of the most important things about the insurance coverage is that it provides a defense to the malpractice claim, however meritless it may be. Do you want to spend tens of thousands of dollars unbudgeted in paying attorneys to represent you in a case, even if you win it? So I think one of the best reasons to get counseling insurance is not because you're going to get hit with a counseling verdict. That's very low probability, but rather to pay for those defense costs, I think, is very important. So, counseling, I agree with you, Jerry. I think that's something that churches should insure against, and it's usually just a modest amount. But you need to be careful about the exclusions under that policy.
Absolutely.
Because I know of in fact, it was my church, there was a counselor that was allowed to use an office in the church to provide counseling services. And I said, well, there are a number of things we need to check out here before we should allow this. And one of them is, I want to read the liability policy. Oh, yes, he had an insurance policy. I said, I want to see it. The first exclusion was sexual misconduct. I said, there's no way this is adequate. So make sure if you have a counseling addendum to your church insurance policy, make sure you look at those exclusions. And if one of those is sexual misconduct, you need a different policy.
The other thing with counseling liability, if the person is paid, so if you're doing some counseling, you'll say, well, we'll counsel you for free for a little bit, but then we're going to do a charge. Most of the insurance policies will not cover it if it is paid, if you're a paid counselor, because then you're considered a professional. Also, if you're a licensed professional, the same thing. There's normally an exclusion for licensed professionals because they want you to buy professional liability. So you have to be very careful in reading the policy when it comes to counseling liability. Let's talk a little bit about automobile now. One of the things that we have seen happen in the past is, and a lot of times, cars are donated to, trucks, whatever, are donated to churches. Or a church may do oil changes for the widows or for the servicemen that are overseas for their spouses. Or they may just do valet parking. Most policies, and I'm going to say, well, from what I look at, with the exception of the ones that we set up, most of those policies will not cover it because it's considered a garage liability. And who on earth would ever think that a church would need garage liability? but it's very, very minor cost. And a lot of church companies won't insure it because they consider it a garage liability. But if you ask for it, there are certain companies that will insure it. But a guy doing valet parking can run into something. Changing the oil, you've got some non-professionals changing oil and they forget to put the oil plug in. You just lost an engine. Let's talk about non-owned automobile liability. One of our largest cases, and it still blows me away because the people said, we don't want to have non-owned automobile. We don't want to pay the extra $30 for it. We don't need it. Secretary runs to the post office to get the mail. She had the state minimum limits here in Missouri, which was $25,000, $50,000 for bodily injury, $10,000 for property damage. She just happened to run into a Mercedes. Driving the Mercedes just happened to be an attorney. His wife was a neurosurgeon. That claim ended up being over $1 million claim. And people say, well, now, how can that person be held responsible because she was driving her own personal car? Her personal liability was that $25,000, $50,000 with $10,000 property damage. Well, most Mercedes cost over $10,000. And she did not total it, but it did $35,000 worth of damage to that car. Having the attorney drive in the car and hurting his wife with the neurosurgeon, she broke her hand. Sort of like your $17 million case with a slip and fall. It was over $1 million because she lost her services of her hand for close to a year. And the insurance company she was with immediately forked over the $25,000 and the $10,000 and said, see you later. Him being an attorney says, who do you work for? She said who she worked for and found out that she was on company time. That's the key. She was on company time, on company business. You as a church can be held responsible if somebody is running an errand for you, even if it's in their own vehicle, and it's on company business or on church business. So it's just a very important factor that we need to take a look at. Let's look at directors and officers liability and employment practices liability. A lot of times we have charitable immunity in a lot of states where you cannot be held if you're not paid for being a director of a church. However, there are some exclusions in there. Do you want to go through those real quick?
Yes, and that's a very important point, Jerry. Every state has a law limiting the liability of uncompensated officers and directors. The federal law, the Federal Volunteer Protection Act of 1997 does the same thing as a matter of federal law. States can be broader in their protections, but not narrower than federal. And so the bottom line is uncompensated officers and directors of nonprofit organizations cannot be liable for their ordinary acts of negligence. This is a way to attract board members to nonprofit organizations that were fleeing because they were afraid of liability. But as you said, Jerry, there are exceptions, and one of them is compensation. This is only uncompensated. So I'm on the board of my church, and every year the board has a Christmas dinner provided by the church, and I always bring a sack lunch, and I sit at the end of the table in silence, secrecy, and the rest of the board say, there he goes again. I don't want to be seen as being compensated by my church. I'm just kidding. I don't take it that far. But I often think, man, is this compensation, this dinner? Am I going to lose my limited immunity from liability for this mess of pottage? And so that you can't be compensated. Secondly, these laws make an exception for gross negligence. Sometimes it's called willful or wanton misconduct. Borders on reckless behavior where this immunity doesn't exist. So let me give you a couple of examples what that might be. Allowing 15-passenger vans to be used by the church without limitation. Failure to adopt a screening program for youth workers, because that will never happen here. Or using non-compliant cribs in the church nursery. Those are just three examples that come readily to mind where a church board allowing any of these can result in personal liability because it would be viewed as willful or wanton misconduct.
That's great. You know what? We're running out of time again. And I think what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to come to this subject one more time. Employment practices liability, work comp, foreign coverage, foreign liability, umbrella, excess liability, key man life.
I don't know if we can cover it in one more session.
You know, I think we're going to do that. I know that a few of you have asked questions, and I've actually I do see your questions because they come up to me on my screen. And if it is off topic, which I notice that, you know, a couple of people are still asking us about concealed carry, which we did a seminar on. All of our past seminars or webinars are actually at AG Financial. If you go to YouTube and hit AG Financial, all of our past webinars are going to be there for you. But if you have questions, go ahead and submit them. We will submit an answer back to you in regards to that, whether you are looking at the webinar or not. We appreciate your time. We'll see you next time. God bless.